Ladies and gentlemen, disparity does not always equal unfair discrimination, aka inequality is sometimes fair. That's really the point of today's episode. Is I want to walk you through a series of ideas that help make it clear as to how do you distinguish between fair and unfair discrimination? How do you distinguish between inequality or unequal outcomes between groups that is in fact evidence of unfair discrimination and ought to be treated with appropriately, versus what are the unequal outcomes between groups that may actually not be a consequence of unfair discrimination, and we ought not treat it as though it is unfair discrimination. So I'm going to use I've got a couple of clips that I'm going to be using as a bit of a canvas to unpack some ideas. I'm going to be using the whiteboard to draw some important figures to help give you some visuals to really ground all this information in. But without further ado, I want this to kind of be a bit of a red pill moment for you, in the sense that in the Matrix, when Neo is making the choice between the blue pill and the red pill, I think we oftentimes we have the option of swallowing a convenient blue pill that is untrue. And I think that's what's going on here, is that sometimes it's very convenient, it's very easy to assume that there has been unfair discrimination between two groups, and we just point to unequal outcome between those two groups as evidence, versus there are actually instances where we ought to expect inequalities between groups, and that might be an uncomfortable truth. But if you believe, right, if you believe in truth, if you believe in anchoring your map or attempting to align your map of the underlying territory, your cognitive framework and understanding of what is, let's get back in focus. If you believe in trying to align your beliefs as accurately as possible with the underlying objective reality, and then using that as a basis to make decisions, to think through things, to decide what we are going to do, what policies we might implement, what course of action is best for tackling the limitation and suffering that is baked into this game of being, then we do need to choose the uncomfortable truth, but the truth nonetheless. So all of that said, I want to start over here, and I want to distinguish or clarify what exactly do I mean by unfair discrimination. That implies that there is such a thing as fair discrimination, and this is very important to understand. So first thing, we can discriminate, have to excuse my handwriting, on an infinitude of different qualities. So for example, let's say that you have a job position and you are hiring someone who's very, very good at a particular skill. Now, let's say this particular skill requires cognitive ability, right? So you might discriminate cognitive ability. You might discriminate based on someone's cognitive ability. You might say, hey, I'm actually going to discern here between those who are cognitively able. You can tell that they are very, very capable of thinking through complex situations, complex problems, generating and implementing solutions, versus perhaps someone who can't do that, right? So we're going to have this person who's, maybe I'll draw this person with a really big head so that we know that this is the smart one and this is the not so smart one, right? And as the employer, you might go, okay, well, I'm hiring for someone who, for a particular job to get done by someone who has a great deal of cognitive ability. And so I'm going to discriminate between those who are not eligible for the job. They do not have the required skills or abilities. And I'm going to discriminate for those who do have what you're looking for. Okay. Now, another example here. I hope that makes sense. So we can discriminate, and I think most people would say that's fair, right? That we discriminate based, in this case, on someone's cognitive ability because it's necessary for the job at hand. Another example might be, all right, discrim. Let's say that you are the coach on a basketball team, yeah? And what are you going to look for in a potential player? There's going to be someone who's very tall over here, and there's going to be a little midget over here. Now, who are you going to pick? Obviously, you're going to discriminate for those who are going to have the abilities, or at least the potential, to perform what it is that you're looking for, and you're going to discriminate against those who do not have what it is that you're looking for, okay? So again, hopefully we can find common ground that is a fair or a form of fair discrimination. Now, usually when we hear this word or when we use this word discrimination, we mean it, at least in certain contexts, people mean it, it has negative connotations. It can be used to mean to discriminate based for or against someone based on a trait that is arbitrary. And here's what I mean by this. And this is where hopefully we can find common ground again. Let's say that you have a job and you're hiring for that job. And over here, we have two candidates, right? We have men and women. And let's say all other things considered equal. Like let's say, again, we're hiring for really the skill that we're looking for is cognitive ability. Now, is there a significant difference in cognitive ability between men and women? Let's for now say, and we'll operate off the assumption, you can go into this in more depth. There is some evidence that there are certain cognitive abilities that men tend to be better at on average, and other cognitive abilities that women tend to be better at on average. But for the moment, we'll operate off the assumption here, or off the basis, or the premise that men and women on average have the same cognitive ability. Now, I think hopefully we can find common ground that discriminating for, say, the male over the female based solely on an arbitrary or unrelated to the job quality, such as one's biological sex, would be an example of unfair discrimination. You're discriminating for or against someone based on an arbitrary characteristic, right? Or essentially a prejudice. You're not discriminating based on good reason. So another example, it might be one's sex, it might be one's race or skin color. It could be any other arbitrary quality. So the point being here that we can discriminate for or against people based on qualities that are either relevant or irrelevant. Or, the term that I've been using over here is arbitrary. And this is where we can say, okay, well, this might actually be a form of what many people would consider fair discrimination, whereas this would be an instantiation of unfair discrimination. Say, for example, discriminating for or against a job applicant simply because of their skin color or their height or their hair color or their eye color or their biological sex, as an example. So, hopefully we can find common ground on that so far, that there are examples of both fair and unfair discrimination. That's very important to be familiar with first and foremost. So let's come back to the whiteboard. What I want to do here is now play clip number 1 and clip number 2 for us to give us some more context. So this is a clip from an interview for the Hoover Institution. I can pop a link in the description. And it's with a gentleman called, I'm not sure what the host name is, my apologies, but the author, who you're about to see in a moment, is called Tom Sowell. Let's take a quick listen.
First question, disparate impact. The legal standard holding that statistical differences in outcomes among groups can be enough to establish illegal discrimination even in the absence of evidence of intentional discrimination. That's the concept. 2 quotations. One is you in your new book, Discrimination and Disparities.
Great book, I might add. And this entire video is in large part inspired by this book. Essentially, the point that's being made in the book is that disparities between groups, so unequal outcomes between groups, to what I was saying before, inequality between groups, unequal outcomes, is not evidence of unfair discrimination. That is the point, or one of the key points of this book.
Quote, the disparate impact standard represents a major departure from American legal principles where the burden of proof is usually on those making the accusation, close quote. Here's the second quotation. This is the journalist Lauren Kirchner writing in The Atlantic. Get ready. Attorneys have used the concept.
I'm going to pause it right there just for a moment and come back to the whiteboard. So actually, I'm going to play the second clip now. That's probably a better idea.
Whenever you look at theory, you see this implicit assumption that all of the groups are very similar in their capabilities, what they want to do, and so forth. When you look at facts, you find disparate impacts everywhere. There's been this story in the Wall Street Journal today about the Irish.
Okay, so what Sowell, that, by the way, that's Tom Sowell, legend. What he meant there by disparate impact is disparate, it was like unequal outcomes. So coming back to the whiteboard, he mentioned that there's this assumption, right? Let's make this a little clearer. Assumption, an implicit assumption that all people or groups are roughly the same. Okay? Now, and what Sowell was saying just there is that's wrong. If you look at the facts, that is not true. And I would also add here that if you believe in things like diversity or the value of diversity, or you simply believe that different people have different abilities and different values, you have to be willing to admit that there are going to be differences between groups. I'll elaborate on that in just a moment. So, essentially, if we have 50-50 of, let's say, it might be males over here and females over here. And this is inspired by an actual example with someone that I knew. I was speaking with this person's mother, and she believed that for things to be fair, there must be equal representation of males and females on medical boards and CEO boards or high-level company boards more generally. And if there wasn't, then it was evidence of unfair discrimination against biological females. Now, if you and I say biological females there just because I've been spending time. We'll skip that part. Don't worry about it. Females in this case. Now, that would also mean that if you were to look at the distribution of, say, I'm just going to pop a little note here, right? The distribution of nurses, or the representation of or proportion of male versus female nurses. There are more female nurses, or say primary school teachers, or say certain levels of educational attainment. The distribution is not 50-50 between male and females are overrepresented. Now, are you willing to say that that is evidence of unfair discrimination? A lot of people would say no, probably, because, maybe males and females make choices with respect to different jobs, and maybe that's represented or manifested in this not 50-50 distribution. I digress, okay? I'm going to come back to that idea later on. So, this person had the notion that it had to be 50-50 distribution of male and female on boards. Now, if it were anything but that, aka if it was unequal outcomes, so let's say it was 70% male and 30% female, this person was taking this as evidence of disparity, means there must have been some kind of unfair discrimination, right? In this case, discrimination based on one's sex, aka the evil patriarchy is to blame. patriarchy. I don't know how to spell patriarchy. Or that there has, there's some kind of underlying misogyny or sexism. Now, you can apply this same thinking to things like race. So let's just say, or skin color, white, and then non-white. Or as an example, where I live, Australia, we might do something like indigenous, and then I'll just write NI over here for non-indigenous. If it's not 50-50, if it's not equal, or at least if there's not equal representation, if there's not some kind of equal distribution, if there's any kind of disparity, then it's been assumed that this is evidence of some kind of unfair discrimination. And this is what Sol was meaning. This is operating off the assumption that all people and groups are fundamentally the same, right? Because if all people and groups were fundamentally the same, and look, this is where you have to be nuanced, yeah? Because on some level, we are all human beings, yeah? On some level, we are all the same. I've been reading The Alchemist recently, and there's this repeated theme that all is one, and all beings are one. We all come from the same. We're all branches of the same tree. We're all waves from the same ocean. But there are also important differences between, say, sexes, but also between, say, racial groups and also cultures. And these have implications for what we ought to expect when it comes to different outcomes between groups. So I want to come back to here. We need to find some common ground on a few things. First things first. Can we agree that different people have different raw abilities? Start with something simple as height. Okay? Can we agree that different people are born with different, that different people have different heights? Like, we have to be able to find common ground on that. Now, we also know that this height element, it's both a combination of nature and nurture. Nature and nurture. In the sense that if you have a base level of nurture, you have just the base ingredients, so to speak, of nutrition, then one will be able to fulfill their biological or genetic potential with respect to height. Okay, so it's mainly nature, but there is kind of like a nurture element required to fulfill the underlying natural potential. So can we agree that different people have different raw abilities, say, for example, with respect to height, or say, for example, with respect to body type and musculature, say, for example, even with respect to the distribution of different either fast twitch or slow twitch muscle fibers? Different people have different raw abilities. Can we agree on that? We can also go so far as to say, okay, well, it's actually not just physical. Maybe we want to also say, and I'm sure this is the more politically incorrect belief here, is that we're all willing to say, okay, that person's taller than that person, so they're probably going to be better at, say, basketball, right? But then the politically incorrect thing is, or that it's almost like we're not ready to handle this truth, is that there are also differences in cognitive ability between different people. Everyone has met someone who is sharp and with it, and who we might say has a high level of cognitive ability, a really high level or ability to think through things clearly and generate solutions, identify problems, whatnot. Whereas there are other people who just don't have that, right? You can tell you've met that person who might be really, really strong, but not very cognitively able. They're a bit slow. Okay, so we need to be able to find some common ground there. Next, from there, we also need to be able to say, well, different people have different values. And this is essentially the essence of valuing diversity, which is to say different people have different value hierarchies that they live out and that we ought to be not encouraging of, but supportive of. So, for example, let's zoom out a little bit here. Let's say that we have two people. We've got person number one, person number two, and they're, for all intents and purposes, for this example at least, they have the same raw abilities. You might even consider like two siblings or two twins, identical twins. Same nature, nurture, starting points perhaps, but we might find that this person has a different set of values. So values number one and values number two. And if given the same set of opportunities, these two people will make different choices and will produce different results or produce different outcomes. Now, we can just as easily turn this into a group of people. So let's say we've got a bunch of people over here and a bunch of people over here, and they have different sets of values or different sets of beliefs despite having the same underlying potential, say biologically, the nature element. Now, if we believe in diversity, this is essentially, by the way, we've now turned this, gone from the individual level to a group level. We've now got culture one over here and culture two. Now, these two cultures, given the exact same opportunity, are going to produce different outcomes, because they're going to make different decisions with respect to where to invest their time, energy, and efforts, given their different value hierarchies, right? These people over here, just to give you an example, right? I'm just coming up with this off the top of my head. These people over here might value more leisure activities, whereas these people over here might value more so, getting at it, the grind, production in some way, shape, or form, okay? And so given the same opportunities, these two groups are then going to produce different outcomes. And, AKA, right, disparity or inequality. And remember, essentially what I'm trying to do here is show you that inequality is fair sometimes, right? So if you believe in individual autonomy, you believe in allowing people to make their own decisions, allowing them to pursue and live out their own value hierarchies, you believe in multiculturalism, or you believe in individualism and liberty, then if given the same opportunity or similar opportunity, you ought to expect different outcomes, disparity, and inequality between these two cultures, and it will have nothing to do, or it won't necessarily be evidence of unfair discrimination between these two groups, okay? Now, this doesn't even have to be different cultures, right? This could be different sexes, right? So, for example, let's zoom out a little bit. We might have males over here, and we might have females over here. And maybe I'll just kind of turn this into dresses. Now, do men and women value different things? Somewhat. Yes. What do men and women select for in the opposite sex? We have different preferences. Just as an example, do men and women select for roles and jobs with different qualities? So for example, maybe I'll let you do your own research here, and I'm just going to float some ideas, but maybe women tend, if given equal opportunity, women might be more attracted to roles which have an element of caretaking or nurturing. They might also be attracted more so to roles where there is more of a family balance. Whereas males might be more attracted to roles which are focused on things, right? Say things like engineering. And maybe I'll just put things and people. You can have a look. You can look into the differences in types of role that men and women select for. A great book that explores this, FYI, is this one here. I'll jump across to the cam. Why Men Earn More, and you can look into exactly why that is. But there's a number of reasons. And that by the way, right, so I've got Sol's book over here, Discrimination and Disparities, would highly recommend. This is exploring the same theme, that just because men and women, on average, men and women make different amounts, does not mean that there has been unfair discrimination or that the patriarchy, the evil patriarchy, is running rampant. It might be because males tend to be more attracted to roles that deal with things, say for example, code, right? And code is very scalable, and therefore it has way more potential to make a lot more money, as compared to roles that deal with people, say nursing. You can't scale the nursing, right? If I invest 1,000 hours into writing a piece of software that I can then deploy to help 1 million people, I can make a lot of money, right? Whereas if I invest 1,000 hours helping people, that it is not as scalable. So just to give you one example here. All this to say, men and women, males and females, this can be the males over here, this can be the females over here, if given the same opportunities, the same layout of different roles and industries into which one might go perhaps, women might choose of their own accord based on their slightly different values as compared to the values of men on average. They will choose different roles, and men will choose different roles, and we ought to expect then different outcomes and a degree of disparity or inequality that we ought not, back to what Sol was saying, we ought not implicitly assume that all people or groups are fundamentally the same and that we ought to end up with equal outcomes, because it's almost like we're swallowing the convenient blue pill that says everyone is fundamentally the same, and therefore if we have disparate outcomes, then there has been unfair discrimination. The uncomfortable truth, the uncomfortable red pill here, is that one, there are different raw abilities, both physically and mentally, and people have different values. And you can look at this not just on the level of the individual, right? Individual, but you can also look at this on the level of groups. Men and women, indigenous and not indigenous, different cultures. They not only have different raw physical and mental abilities, but also different values. And again, this is where if you are pro-freedom, you are pro-liberty, you are pro-individualism and being able to live your life how you see fit, and you're also pro, say, multiculturalism, pro-diversity, you can't have your cake and eat it too and also be for equal outcomes, right? Because the two they're mutually exclusive. They do not go hand in hand. Okay, so I've mentioned this. It applies to groups and cultures. Equal opportunity versus equal outcomes. Value for individualism and diversity. Having your cake and eating it too. Okay, now I want to jump across to a paragraph that I had pre-written when I was making sense of all this. And this will just clarify some of the key ideas here. So, sameness of opportunity, if left to our own devices and allowed to exercise free will, does not beget sameness of outcome. It's important we know this from the outset, because otherwise an assumption of sameness, this is the implicit assumption which Sol was speaking of, i.e. we're all fundamentally the same and will make the same decisions if presented with the same opportunities, will lead us to erroneously conclude that difference in outcome is evidence of unequal opportunity. This is simply not the case. 1 second, I got to turn the aircon on here because it's getting toasty. Okay. We are not all the same. Different people make different decisions. If presented with the same opportunities, we won't always pick the same path forward as the person next to us. And the same applies for groups. Different groups may make different choices if presented with the same opportunities. This is all to say, like, yay for multiculturalism. Yes for multiculturalism. Yes for diversity. But if you are for multiculturalism and diversity and different ways of being, different value structures or hierarchies, and being able to live out those different hierarchies or different values, then you also have to be for a degree of difference in outcome between groups, aka disparity. Disparity does not conclusively imply or prove unequal opportunity nor unfair discrimination. Now, I might quickly jump across here and just mention, can disparity suggest unfair discrimination has taken place? Yes. Okay, so when we see disparity between groups or disparity in outcome between groups, is it reasonable to go, hey, is this a consequence of different people with different abilities making different decisions given fairly similar opportunities? If so, then maybe we have an example of fair, or like maybe this disparity is fair and not evidence of unfair discrimination. Or is this disparity potentially born of some kind of unfair discrimination? And then you have to go and investigate. Whereas what we're doing, or at least what a lot of people are doing, is simply assuming that the disparity is evidence of the unfair discrimination. And that's essentially the red pill of this book is no, sorry. Disparity does not mean that unfair discrimination has occurred. You need to go deeper. You need to do your due diligence to find supporting evidence for such claims. Now, I will mention, I'm going to go deeper later on in this video as to why are we voluntarily, it's like, why are we so quick to swallow this? Why are we so quick to swallow the convenient blue pill, which is false, but nonetheless convenient, right? And we don't do this for no reason. There is good reason. I will explore it later in this video. Why do we swallow the convenient lie, we might say, or untruth, that all disparity is evidence of discrimination? Okay, let's come back to here. We'll finish this off. Now, all this is not to say there is no racism or no sexism, only that disparity cannot conclusively be used as evidence of it. To summarize, difference in outcomes can be a consequence of two things. One, differences between individuals and groups regarding their values. I'm going to add here, they're either their values or abilities. You might, I don't know if it helps you, but say raw abilities, things like height or cognitive ability also has an element of nature. And you can, perhaps I won't go down that rabbit hole just yet. Or two, the differences in outcome can be a consequence of the differences between individuals and group regarding their access to opportunity, right? And that I think where we can find common ground, hopefully, is that in the type of equality that we can stand for is, let's see whether we can give everyone equal opportunity or maximize the opportunity of every individual to manifest their potential. Can we find common ground on that, hopefully? Okay. It's important to not conflate these two, right? You don't want to conflate limited access to opportunity or unequal access to opportunity, or someone having limited access to opportunity. You don't want to conflate that with actually these two groups of people or these two individuals, as an example, actually have different values and they choose different lifestyles for one another or for themselves, I should say, and therefore we ought to expect differences in outcome. Doing so will lead to a poorly defined problem and an equally poorly informed solution. So this is just a recurring theme, right? That people are so quick to jump to, I have the solution, right? They see, again, this is the convenient blue pill. Oh, I know what the problem is. I see disparity, it must be discrimination, therefore I have the solution, social justice. Okay? Not that simple. Again, I'm going to come back to why people choose that blue pill. But what we need to do first, and this is my fundamental belief, is that we have to accurately identify the problem. If you don't accurately identify the problem, or it's like, think of a doctor. If you misdiagnose the issue, or you see something in someone and it's actually, it's actually not an issue, or it's not a sickness, or it's not a manifestation of disease or pathology, and the doctor sees it and quickly goes, oh, that's a tumor, we need to kill it. The solution, the treatment that the doctor is going to give to the patient is misinformed, fundamentally misinformed. And what's more, it might do more harm than good. Okay, so we need to invest the time in clearly identifying the root cause of a problem, identifying if there actually is a problem, first of all. And notice again there, people are choosing to quickly see something and say problem, and therefore I know the solution, as opposed to going, hey, is that actually a problem? Has unfair discrimination taken place here? Yes or no? Let me do my due diligence, and then if I can identify the unfair discrimination, I'm with you, right? If you can identify the unfair discrimination, that's where you've got everyone on board. Let's go and find that unfair discrimination. But let's not misdiagnose here and quickly, prescribe a convenient solution that makes us feel good about ourselves. Okay, let's come back. An important follow-on from this is, if individuals hold different values and when given the same opportunities will make different decisions, the only way to get sameness of outcome, equity, you might hear, otherwise referred to as equality of outcome or equity, is to impose unequal opportunity. Okay, now, perhaps what I will do, I'll just quickly finish this paragraph and then I'll draw this out. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're for equality of opportunity and you accept the premise that different people hold different values, aka you're pro multiculturalism and diversity, then you cannot be for sameness of outcome. Okay, this is an important point that I really want to make clear. Jeez. All right, let's go up here. So, if you believe, right? Let's pull this down. Different abilities. We also have abilities or values, right? Some people are going to say, no, we don't actually have different abilities. It's all a matter of, unequal opportunity. So maybe that's going to be harder to find common ground on. But that's where I think if you don't believe that, say, IQ or cognitive ability has a nature element, and you believe that everyone fundamentally has the same starting point cognitively, then it's much easier to find common ground with people that different people have different abilities with respect to, like, raw talent with respect to something like height, and therefore basketball. So different abilities or values plus, let's go opportunity. And then let's go outcome. Oh, I know how to do this. This will be nice. Let's go like this. So we've kind of got three variables here. Yeah, this is like variable 1. And then variable 2. And then output. So it's like two inputs, input 1, two inputs over here, input 1, input 2, and then we have our output over here. So if you have same abilities and values, and you have different opportunities, then you're going to get different outcomes. Okay? This seems pretty straightforward. And this is where people want to ensure that we get equal opportunity, right? So let's change this and make this, I'm going to rub this out. Let's say we have a bunch of people who fundamentally have the same raw abilities and values. I don't know whether it helps thinking of those two identical twins. If they are given the same or equal opportunity, then we're going to end up with the same outcome, or again, like equality of outcome, equity, right? So this seems pretty straightforward, right? If you hold all these variables as equal, the two inputs as equal, you're going to get the output as equal as well between the two groups. The problem here, and what Sol was mentioning before, is that this simply, like over here, this is simply wrong. We conveniently assume that different groups of people, say men and women, or say different racial groups, or say different cultural groups, we assume far too quickly and conveniently that they have the same raw abilities and raw values, and that just isn't the case. So this is different a lot of the time. I'll just give you an example. If we just look at abilities, which racial group, or let's look at the height differences between different racial groups. Can we find common ground that different racial groups have different average heights? So, for example, Asians tend to be shorter than say African Americans, right? That would be a good example. On average, they have different raw abilities with respect to their height and maybe things like a vertical leap, right? So then, given the same opportunity, okay, now we need to adjust this because we've edited the inputs over here on the left-hand side of the screen, right? Now we have different raw abilities. Let's say we have Asians and African Americans. Let's say they're given the same or equal opportunity to go into the NBA or to try out for NBA teams. What are we going to expect over here? Are we going to expect equal outcome between those two racial groups? Are we going to expect just as many, 5'5" Asians as compared to 6'5" African Americans in the NBA? Of course not. No one in their right mind would think that. And no one in their right mind would think that that's evidence of unfair discrimination, right? So we're going to get different... I haven't spelled that correctly, but screw it. We're going to get different outcomes between Asian, a group of Asians and a group of African Americans, because given the same opportunity, given a fair go, we might say, they have different raw abilities. And so we have to expect a different outcome or a disparity, and that not equaling unfair discrimination. Okay? Now, hopefully you can find common ground with people on that, right? Is the fact that there are fewer Asians in the NBA, can we find, as compared to, say, African Americans, can we find common ground that that is not evidence of unfair discrimination? Okay? Can we find common ground that maybe it has something to do with their raw abilities or even the cultural values? Okay? So maybe within African American culture, they value basketball as a sport more so than do Asian cultures. Now, you might apply, you might flip this to do the exact same thing with something, there's going different cultures are going to value different things. So, for example, maybe Asian culture values studies, applying oneself to one's studies more so than African American culture, perhaps. You might also, now this is where it gets a bit red hot. Yeah. What about cognitive ability? are there differences in cognitive ability between different racial groups? Say, for example, there's some good evidence. Now, I'm going to encourage you to do your own research here, but there's some good evidence that Ashkenazi, I can't say it, Jews have a higher IQ on average than do many other racial groups. Okay. Now, that implies that other racial groups are going to have a lower average cognitive ability. It's averages, yeah? Average cognitive ability as compared to the Jews. Okay, so let's come back to just this outline here. I've read you that paragraph. Okay, now that I've read you that paragraph, I do want to come back here and finish off. So, difference in outcome is not evidence of unfair or unjust inequality of opportunity. It can be an indication of it. So if we see disparity between groups, we ought to ask ourselves the question, could this be a consequence of unfair discrimination or unequal opportunity? And is there something to address here or to address? But it is not in and of itself conclusive proof. We need to be more diligent for that. And again, I'm going to come to, why are we choosing to not be more diligent? Why are we choosing to say, boom, it's racism, or boom, it's sexism? It's because it's convenient. With that blue pill is convenient, and it's serving us and meeting some of our needs. And I'm going to, like I said, jump onto that later. Okay. I would like to briefly acknowledge that equality without specification for opportunity or outcome and equity are amorphous terms that many well-meaning people use to mean the redistribution of resources to help those with less opportunity. To these people, I'll assume positive intent and simply ask, to what end is this redistribution fair and just? If you use either term, equality or equity, you ought to know precisely what you're referring to and the implications of what you may be advocating for. I think this is just a mistake that a lot of people make. Equity sounds like equality, and I'm for equality, but it's like we haven't really done the thinking to define, okay, what type of equality here? Are we for equality of outcome, which is to say there ought to be no disparity between different groups, which is to say if there is any disparity between different groups, then it must be evidence of unfair discrimination. So be careful when people say equity, assume positive intent, assume they're coming from a good place, unless, but obviously probe a little further. They might be operating from a place of ignorance, or what I'll get to later on, they might be operating from a place of resentment, perhaps the spirit of Cain. It's worth noting that values, i.e. valuing one thing over another, can be both biologically derived, bottom up, and culturally inculcated, top down. I'll let that simmer in your mind without going deeper on it. I want to come back to here. So, all right, quick recap. Hopefully, all that makes sense so far. There are unfair types of discrimination. There are also fair types of discrimination. You might discriminate for or against someone based on something that seems very reasonable, very relevant to whatever it is you are doing, right? Like, you discriminate, very reasonably so, for and against individuals when it comes to heart surgery, right? If you're going under the knife, so to speak, you're discriminating for someone who can demonstrate to you that they have what it takes to perform the job appropriately, right? So that form of discrimination is what I think many people can find common ground on, is very fair. Whereas an unfair form of discrimination, as an example, would be saying, I don't want this, I want that surgeon because of some prejudice. Say, for example, because of this person's skin color. I like this person's skin color compared to that surgeon's skin color. Or I like this person's biological sex or sex over that person's sex. Say, for example, if someone were to say, I don't want that heart surgeon because she's a woman, that would be an example of unfair discrimination in the sense that you're discriminating for or against someone based on an arbitrary characteristic or an irrelevant characteristic. Hopefully you can find common ground with me on that and others on that. So there's forms of fair and unfair discrimination. Beyond that, we also need to be able to find common ground that different people have different raw abilities, be they mental or cognitive or physical or athletic, and also that different people have different values, right? Diversity, individualism. Your values are going to be different to mine. Us, if we have the same raw abilities or talents, given the same opportunities, we're likely going to make different choices with respect to how we live our lives. We should be okay with the fact that we might choose different lifestyles. You might choose to work a 60-hour work week, whereas I might choose to work a 20-hour work week. Right? Even though we both have the ability to pump out a 60-hour work week, I might, for one reason or another, choose a different lifestyle to you, or vice versa. And if we then look at the fruits of our labor, right? The fruits of your labor are going to be very different to the fruits of my labor. And that's not because I've been unfairly discriminated against, because I might have chosen to work 20 hours a week when you've chosen to work 60 hours a week, right? And you can apply that same thinking. Where's my book? You can apply that exact same thinking to why men earn more. As an example, on average, how many hours a week does a man want to work compared to a woman? I'll let you dive into that rabbit hole yourself. But differences in outcome, say for example, between males and females and the amount of money that they make, is not in and of itself evidence of unfair discrimination. Okay, now all of this applies to groups and cultures. So not only do different individuals have different raw abilities and different values, but also different groups, be it racial groups, be it sexes, be it cultures, have different raw abilities and different values. And I gave that example. Geez, I really do have to apologize for my drawing here, but I mean, hopefully you enjoy it anyway. I kind of like drawing it. Hopefully I've demonstrated with this diagram here that we have two inputs, abilities and values, and then also opportunity, and that's going to lead to the outcome. And that if we are willing to say, right, if we are willing to say that we are going to have different abilities and values between individuals and also between different groups, then given the same opportunity, we should still expect a degree of disparity or inequality, which does not necessarily mean that unfair discrimination has taken place. All of which is to say, inequality is fair sometimes. Okay, now I've added this sometimes because hopefully I don't need to repeat myself over and over again on this, but disparity between groups should lead to the question, has there been unfair discrimination? And then you need to go and find evidence for that unfair discrimination, as opposed to operating off the convenient blue pill that all individuals, groups, and cultures are fundamentally the same, have the same abilities, or have the same values, or have the, and if you're operating off that convenient assumption, untrue as it may be, then you're going to potentially misdiagnose any and all disparity as evidence of unfair discrimination. Okay, sweet. That's a good starting point. Now, from here, statistics 101, means extremes, disparity, and fairness. Now, I want to jump across to a piece written by a gentleman called Steven Pinker, and then I'm going to draw us a diagram, or I'm going to show you some diagram, and we need to understand how differences in these raw abilities, as an example, can result in rather significant disparities, perhaps far more so than we might expect. And again, you need to understand this so as to not misdiagnose disparity as evidence of unfair discrimination. So let's jump across to Pinker's piece over here. And I'm going to read this segment for us. Let me just make sure that you can see. Yep, awesome. Does this mean, and the beginning of this might not make sense, but I'll give it some context in a moment. Their average IQ has been measured at 108 to 115, 1/2 to 1 standard deviation above the mean. He's referring to Ashkenazi, I hope I'm Ashkenazi Jews. So their average IQ is higher than the average population. Okay, so up to 8 to 15 points higher, which is 1/2 to 1 standard deviation above the mean. And I'm going to go into Statistics 101 in a moment so you understand what these, what is a standard deviation? What does that mean? But statistics have long known that a moderate difference in the means of two distributions translates into a large difference at the tails. This is crucial. This took me so long to wrap my head around. And Jordan Peterson has touched on this in some of his videos, but I'm going to draw you a diagram that will hopefully, it took me a long time to get to this point and like drawing the diagrams myself and then having that red pill moment of going, aha. And I'm going to see if I can give that to you in this video. In the simplest case, if we have two groups of the same size and the average of group A exceeds the average of group B by 15 IQ points, so he's focused on IQ at the moment, or cognitive ability, then among people with an IQ of 115 or higher, the A's, which is like group A, will outnumber the B's by a ratio of 3 to 1. But among people with an IQ of 160 or higher, the A's will outnumber the B's by a ratio of 42 to 1. Now, the point here, I want to come back to here. A moderate difference in the means or averages of two distributions translates into a large difference at the tails. So I'm gonna draw this out, so stick with me. Even if Group A was a fraction of the size of Group B to begin with, it would contribute a substantial proportion of the people who had the highest scores. Okay, so let's come back to the whiteboard here because this is complex, but nonetheless important. Actually, so I'm not going to jump to the whiteboard. I've actually got some diagrams over here on Notion that I've pre-prepared for us. So let me make sure you can see this. Fantastic. So this is a normal distribution. When you have a normal distribution, essentially, we've got the mean or the average over here, and you can think about the area underneath the graph as the population. So let's say this is a normal distribution of IQ. So the average IQ score is 100. So this number here would be 100 in the middle. And then 50% of the area underneath the graph, which represents 50% of the population, is going to lie to the right, which is to say 50% of the population is going to be above the average IQ of 100. And then 50% is going to lie here on the left-hand side, which is to say that 50% of the population will have an IQ less than 100. I'm actually going to, I think this will be easier to explain if I actually pull up the whiteboard and draw this out. And I'm going to keep the diagram in front of me so I remember to include all the details. So we've got our normal distribution, okay? And we've got an IQ. Let's just take IQ, but you can do this with any quality or attribute. You could do it with IQ, you could do it with height, right? So let's say we've got an average IQ of 100, okay? Now, 50% of the population is going to have an IQ above 100, and 50% of the population is going to have an IQ below 100. And this is called a normal distribution. Okay. Now, we have what's referred to as, now I might get some of the technical terminology here, but it's more so the idea that is important that I want to get across. So there are what we refer to as standard deviations. I'm going to write SD down here to mean standard deviation. This is a measure of variance or spread. So you can have distributions that look like the one I've drawn here, or you can have distributions that have less spread or less variance, right? Which would look like that. So notice how all of the, if we were to say, let me show you, right? If we were to say, okay, where's the middle 50% of this population? Maybe we'd say, okay, this is representative, here to here, covers roughly 50% of the population, and then we're going to have the remainder 25% out here, and 25% out here. Okay. Now, there will be certain distributions that have smaller spread. So you'll have something like this. I'll show you. You'll have something like this, okay? That would have smaller spread or smaller variance. And we'd say, okay, well, 50% of that population is actually between these 2 points. So the variance of the yellow is larger, whereas the variance or the spread of the green is lower, right? Because 50% of the population might be between like 96 and 104 in IQ for the green, whereas 50% of the population for the yellow might be between like 90 and 110. Okay, so the key idea here is just that I want you to understand that different normal distributions can have different degrees of spread or variance. And standard deviation, SD, is a measure of spread or measure of variance. Okay, let's go SD. Uh-oh, what's going on here? Let me just pause the video and figure out. All right, and we're back. My apologies, just had a technical issue. So, standard deviation is a measure of variance. This is important to understand. Now, when it comes to standard deviation, let me pull up my diagram so I make sure that I draw the right things for us over here. So we need to understand that we can have a standard deviation. I'm going to write 0. This is actually referred to technically as a z-score, 0 and 1 and -1. And then we can also have like 2 and -2. Now you might be thinking, this is boring, like get back to the point. Trust me, this is part of the point. This is really important to understand. So this, between one standard deviation, either side of the mean, we're going to have all of this area here is going to account for 64, I believe it's, 68% of the population. So this is important. 68% is between -1 -1 and 1 standard deviation. -1 standard deviation to 1 standard deviation. Can we see that? Yeah, fantastic. Okay, now then we can go to the edges a little more. So when we get to 2 standard deviations, we're going to have, let's have a look. There's going to be, I might actually jump across to what I've got over here. Essentially, there's going to be another 13%, roughly 13% of the population here, 13% of the population here, and just some quick math, right? This is going to be 34% of the population, 34% of the population. Now remember, just before I had 68%. You can see this plus this is 68. So the point being here that we have a distribution of IQ in this case, right? And so, by the way, 1 standard deviation when it comes to measurement of IQ is equivalent to 15 IQ points. So here we would have an IQ of 115, and down here we would have an IQ of 85. And then so 2 standard deviations, this is you might see a symbol like this. So 1 standard deviation above the mean, 2 standard deviations above the mean or the average of 100 is going to be 130 IQ. And then you can see, right, we're going up here, 145, and then 160. Okay, so this is 3 standard deviations above the mean, and this is 4 standard deviations above the mean. Now you can see, at least I hope that I'm making it obvious, that we end up with tiny proportions of, between the percentage of the population of any given population that is between 2 standard deviations and 3 standard deviations above the mean is 2.1%. 1%. And then above 3 standard deviations of the mean is 0.1%. Okay, so 0.1% of the population has an IQ above 145. Right, now these numbers, they might be slightly off. You can go do your own research. But the concept, what you have to understand here, is how we have a standard deviation, which is a measure of variance. This can be applied to things like IQ, or it can be applied to things like one's height. Yeah, so, only 0.1% of the population will have a height that is 3 standard deviations above the mean. The same way, if we go down here, and remember this symbol is standard deviations, we are going to have, again, 2.1%, and down here, 0.1%. So 0.1% of the population, we are going to expect to have an IQ of, this is going to be minus another 15 will end up at 70, and then minus another 15 will end up at 55. So 0.1% of the population is going to have an IQ below 55, which I think there's a classification at which this is considered a mental retardation or a mental disability. I think it's something like an IQ of 65. So now, this is important. This is the mean, the average, and these out here are what we will refer to as the extremes. Extremes. Or tail. The tails of the distribution. Very, very small percentage of the population is going to be, say, above 3 standard deviations of the mean, or below, 3 standard deviations below the mean. Why is all of this important? You might have zero interest in statistics, and I don't blame you, but it is important. So bear with me here. The reason why this is important is, I might actually even mention there's this empirical rule, which is 68, 95, 99.7. And what this is to say that between, now I wonder whether I can keep this in shot just so we've got a mental or a visual over here. So we've got our distribution, and I'll write this down here, 68, 95, 99.7. So 68% of the population is going to lie between, I'll go 68%, will lie between -1 standard deviation and +1 standard deviation above the mean. So that's this 68% here, right? Then 95% of the population is going to lie between -2 standard deviations and +2 standard deviations. And then hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. 99.7% is going to lie between -3 and +3 standard deviations below or above the mean. Now, again, you might be thinking, what does all of this have to do with disparity and discrimination? And I want us to come back to Pinker's piece here. Statisticians, right? This is where it's easy for us to overlook this as lay people. Statisticians have long known that a moderate difference in the means of 2 distributions translates into a large difference at the tails. Why is that relevant? Okay, this is where it becomes interesting. So let's come up here. We have another normal distribution. Okay. And let's say that we have, again, we're going to take the average IQ of, this is 0 standard deviations. Just go, that little symbol. And I'll go 1 standard deviation. And I'll go -1 standard deviation. 2 standard deviations. You get the idea. So we've got an average IQ of say 100. Then this is going to be 115. It's going to be 130. Hopefully, again, you can see where I'm going here. This is going to be 85, and this is going to be 70. Okay. Now, what if we have another population, a particular population of people that on average have a higher IQ? So a difference in their mean IQ. It's not going to be another distribution that just kind of overlaps here. It's instead, the middle of their distribution is going to be here. And so it's going to look something more like this. Okay? And this is pretty much what we have, or what Steven Pinker is pointing to with respect to, this is the general population. General population. And this is Ashkenazi Jews. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, you could, FYI, you could swap this out for Asians, right? Asians have a higher IQ, average IQ than than the average, but then also other racial groups. Now, you can also do this, just to be clear, with something like height again, right? And you're going to have different groups, different, say, racial groups, who are going to have, on average, they're going to have a higher average height, obviously. So their normal distribution is going to be slightly different. Now, why does this matter? Let's just say this is group A, and this is group B. Now, if we have a selection point, so I might add here, so for the Ashkenazi Jews, right, notice how 50% of their population has, as an example in this case, IQ, right, 50% IQ greater than 115, okay? Whereas for the general population, I'm going to color it in green here. For the general population, only, what is it? Let me just crunch the numbers real quick. Right, only the portion of the population that has an IQ above 1 standard deviation above the mean, right? So let me just quickly grab the number here. All right, so I'm just going to jump across to the screen share because I punched these numbers in advance here. So 68%, like I mentioned before, 68% is within 1 standard deviation from the mean, which is to say that 1 standard deviation above the mean is the 84th percentile, which is the top 16%, which is this here. So it's like 4, it's roughly 16%, something like that. Which I've actually written here, top 16%. So let's come back to the diagram, and I will show this in a drawing, right? So this green part here, only 16% of the general population has an IQ above 115. Okay, so this is crucial. This is absolutely crucial. We have two populations here with a difference in means, right? A difference in averages, where the Jews have an average IQ 1 standard deviation up to 1 standard deviation above the mean. I'm just going to say 1 standard deviation above the mean IQ of the general population, for example's sake here. And which means that 50% of the Jewish population is going to have an IQ above 115, whereas only 16% of the general population is going to have an IQ above 115. Okay, Now we get into why that is so important. So remember before, the key words that I was running with before was means, extremes. If we come back here, means, extremes, disparity, and fairness. Okay? So let's come back here. Let's say, hypothetically, we had a job that selected only for those who had an IQ above 115. Okay? Let's say we had a job, it was selecting for, or we were discriminating for applicants who had the cognitive ability that was equivalent to like 115 or above in IQ, okay? So we're selecting for some kind of IQ or some kind of cognitive ability. Now let's say 50 people from the general population apply and 50 people from the 50 Jews apply. Ashkenazi Jews apply. Now, if only 10 people are selected for the role, are we going to expect there to be 5 of the general population and 5 Jews? No. We're not going to expect equal outcome. We're going to expect unequal outcomes because we have a difference in mean IQ or mean cognitive ability between these two groups. Now, what I want to get clear on is what should be expected. So we know that we're not going to get 50-50, but what should be expected, right? Given we know the average or the mean IQ for these two groups, and we're selecting for one standard deviation above the mean, what is the disparity that we ought to expect between the two groups? Let me grab the numbers. All right, so I just grabbed that document and I've put it across the iPad so I can annotate it here, and I want to run through this. So for overlapping distributions, right, we've got two distributions, or the distributions in this case of cognitive ability between the general population, and then we've layered on top of that the distribution of Ashkenazi Jews who have on average a higher IQ that is roughly one standard deviation above the mean of the general populace. If group A, say 1,000 people, has a standardized mean of 0 for their Z-score, which is to say a mean of 100 IQ, and group B has a standardized mean of 1, which is to say a Z-score of 1, which is to say their mean is one standard deviation above the mean of the general population. So this is the Ashkenazi Jews that we're talking about. This is like the Jewish IQ of 115, right? And this is like the general population. I'll just write Gen 100 IQ. If we have this, and their variance and spread is the same, so we're assuming that their normal distributions have equal variance, then at and above one standard deviation above the mean, the ratio of group B to group A is 3-1. Okay, what does that mean? In this situation, we have a role that is selecting for cognitive ability above one standard deviation. We have equal number of applicants from group A and group B. Kind of pushing those applicants through the filter of we're only going to be selecting for those with a cognitive ability that is above this 115 IQ, one standard deviation above the mean of the general population. What should we expect in terms of outcomes or representation? We should expect 3 Jews for every 1 from the general population. And that will have nothing to do with unfair discrimination. Okay? That's kind of interesting, yeah? So if we just apply a reasonable selector, in this case, cognitive ability above a certain point, one standard deviation above the general population, we should expect a 3-1 representation of Jews or group B, right? Group B to group A. So I might even do, let me draw a quick table, yeah? We've got group A. We'll go like this, group A, group B, and we've got, let's say this is the selector. Yeah, this is a great way to do it. Okay, so let's say the selector is plus 1 standard deviation above the mean of general population group A. So we're going to get a ratio of 1 for every 1 person from group A that makes it through this selection process. We're going to get 3 Jews who make it through the selection process, okay? Now we can do this. What about if the selection criteria was even tougher? What if instead of being here, where we get all of this population and all of this population down here in the yellow and also the green, what if the selection criteria was actually an IQ of 130 now? So even an even more harsh or stringent selection criteria. Now you can see at this point, now the differences start to become very, very obvious, in the sense that there is only a very small portion of the general population that has an IQ above 2 standard deviations from the mean, right? Whereas there's actually still a significant portion of the Jewish population that's going to have an IQ above 2 standard deviations of the mean of the general population. Okay, so, and I'm just going to quickly grab some percentages to make this especially clear. Okay, so for the general population, right, in the green, over here, let's say we've got a selection criteria that is now 2 standard deviations above the mean of the general population. This is going to be 2.1%. So only 2.1% of the population will make it past this this selection criteria of 2 standard deviations above the mean, in this case for IQ, 130 IQ points. Now, what about the Jews? If we jump across to yellow here, now because their standard, their mean is actually not 100 and it's actually 115, and again, Pinker mentions it's between half a standard deviation and 1 standard deviation above the mean of the general population. So it's somewhere between like a 108 and 115. But just for example's sake, I'm going to say it's 115, 1 standard deviation above the mean. How much of the Jewish population does this account for, right? So above 130 IQ, it's for them, right? For population B, or for group B, for the Ashkenazi Jews, if I mispronounce that one more time, it is roughly 16% of the population. So 16% of Jews will make it past this selection criteria, whereas only 2% of the general population will make it past this criteria. Roughly. Okay? So now let's get some more figures down here. Okay, so as the selection criteria gets higher and higher, or more and more stringent, we are going to expect, this is getting difficult to draw, we are going to expect a greater and greater disparity between the two populations. And again, it's not going to be self-evident evidence of unfair discrimination. It's simply going to be born of the fact that these two groups have different means, and the greater the selection pressure, the harsher the selection criteria, the more we should expect a disparity between the two groups and their representation. And again, this is coming back to Stevens, that one sentence that I was showing you before, which is a moderate difference in the means, right? Only 1 standard deviation one standard deviation difference between the two means, so 115 IQ points, translates to large differences at the tails, which is to say, the more stringent the selection criteria, the more stringent the selection criteria, the more you end up selecting for just the tails, and the more we're going to see a disparity. Okay, so that said, right, what are we going to see over here? if we have a selection criteria that is one standard deviation above the mean of the general population, we're going to expect a disparity or a difference in ratio or representation of 1 to 3. If we have a selection criteria of 2 standard deviations above the mean, we're going to expect a disparity between the general population who make it through compared to Jews who make it through. As an example, in this case, 1 to 6. 3 standard deviations, we're going to get 1 to 17. And here's 4 standard deviations above the mean. We should expect a ratio of group B to group A of 42 to 1. Okay? So this is like 6 to 1. And then what I said, something like 17 to 1. And then for the last bit, I haven't made the table large enough. For the last bit, it's going to be the difference in ratio is going to be 1 to, 42? Yeah, 1 to 42. Which is all to say small differences at the mean, which are almost unnoticeable, have a significant impact at extremes. So you might, on average, not go, meet Jewish people and think, oh, they have significantly higher IQ. You're not going to do that on average because the average difference is actually not all that noticeable, right? Almost unnoticeable. But if you have a stringent selection criteria that really only selects for the tail end of the, selection at the very tail end of the distribution, this is an artwork, a piece of art, then you have to expect rather significant disparities. Selection often takes place at the extremes. So, for example, now this does not just apply to Ashkenazi Jews. I'm going to draw a quick diagram and I'll explain in this case, right? What does it take to be a CEO? Just ask yourself that question. What does it take to be a CEO? Maybe, on average, you need to be extremely stoic and almost like unmoved by pressure. You need to be the opposite of emotionally volatile or susceptible to emotional volatility. Now, men and women, on average, is there a difference in emotional volatility? Right? You can answer. You make up your own mind here, but let's say that there was a mild difference, right? Or let's say that men, on average, are more risk-taking, or that men, on average, are more disagreeable, more willing to stand steadfast in the face of very difficult negotiations. Now, these it's not like I'm saying, to be clear, I'm not saying men are better than women. I'm just saying there are certain character traits or certain personality traits that that would be favorable to CEOs that men may outperform on average compared to women. And you can do the exact same thing in the opposite for something like nursing, right? A compassionate disposition. Would you say that on average women are better at, say, caretaking? You can apply the exact same thinking. Okay, so here, again, we have 2 distributions. It's not all that noticeable, the difference, right? This is we can say this is I think this is the symbol for the mean or the average. This is 1 standard deviation above the average. Again, selection at the extremes. Let's say that it's really only 4 standard deviations above the mean. Let's say it's really only those. Let's also say that this is like group B, males, and group A, females. Let's say that this is hypothetically, right? Let's just say this is a measure of stoicness, right? The ability to remain steadfast in the face of a lot of pressure and not be emotionally volatile. And let's say that to become a CEO, we're only selecting for those who are 4 standard deviations above the mean or something like this. We are going to expect, again, coming back to those ratios, yeah? We're going to expect many more males than we will females in CEO positions, as an example, or positions that require a high degree of stoicism, the opposite of emotional volatility. And I'm just going to write 1 to 42. And that may well have nothing to do with unfair discrimination against women for simply being women. It may have everything to do with discrimination, fair discrimination for certain character traits that we actually want in CEOs, or character traits that we might want in heart surgeons or whatever, or certain character traits that we like, just switch these two, right? Certain character traits that we might want in a nurse, or that we might want in a primary school teacher. All of this to say, small differences in means or averages result in rather significant disparities if selection takes place at the extremes. And so you might see something like this and go, okay, there's definitely some unfair discrimination going on if we have a representation of 42 to 1, but it's not necessarily the case. And it's all to do with Statistics 101. Yeah, Statistics 101. The fact that we can have quite small differences at the means that result in very noticeable disparities at the extremes. I might write that down just so we have this visual here, right? So small differences in mean can lead to large disparity if selection takes place at the extremes. And just remember that number. If selection is taking place at 4 standard deviations above the mean, and you have 2 populations that have a difference in mean of 1 standard deviation, you should expect for every 42, let's switch it, for every 1 from Group A, you should expect 42 from Group B if we are discriminating fairly, right? And this is where it just doesn't, our heuristics, our mental shortcuts as human beings, we're just not designed for these types of statistics. We would see that disparity on a piece of paper, 42 to 1, and go, there's got to be some unfair discrimination there. And this is all to just point out that if there are differences in the mean, it can result in very, very disparate outcomes or different outcomes if selection is taking place at the extremes. Now, one application of this, Jewish people are significantly overrepresented amongst Nobel Prizes. Is that evidence of unfair discrimination? I would say maybe not, right? Maybe it's got something to do with the fact that they have a higher average cognitive ability as compared to other ethnic or racial groups. You can do the exact same thing with African Americans and basketball, right? We have, compared to the underlying general population, why is it that African Americans are overrepresented in the NBA? Is anyone going to say that it's a consequence of unfair discrimination against Asians? Right? Maybe not. Maybe it's because there's a fairly, it's actually quite noticeable difference in the means, the average heights of, say, African Americans and Asians. But when you then have a selector, a very stringent selector, it's probably only those who have a vertical leap that is 4 standard deviations or above that of the general population, you're going to end up with disproportionately African Americans as compared to Asians. Say, remember that ratio of 42-1, and it's not going to be born of unfair discrimination. It'll be born of a difference in means between the two populations, and then a selection criteria that operates on the tails of the distributions or at the extremes. Okay, I hope that I have explained that well enough. Now, we can apply this to sex. I've kind of already shown you how we can apply this thinking to the disparities that we might see between males and females when it comes to representation in CEO roles or even within particular industries. We can apply this to racial groups. We can apply this to different cultures. We can even apply this to gender, say, for example, trans identifying individuals. Whatever two groups or two populations you have, you can have differences in averages that may not be all that noticeable, but then if you have a selection criteria that's operating at the extremes, the differences or disparities between the two groups become very noticeable. So I want to jump back across to the laptop here, and I'm going to play a brief little clip from Jordan Peterson. Let's take a listen.
Okay, all right, what the hell? Address the Jewish question. That's a hell of a thing to ask. So that's Jack Lintern, you know? I mean, really, that's a hell of a thing to ask. But I will say something about it, you know, and I've thought about this a lot. So there is evidence that Ashkenazi Jews, so those are Jews of European heritage, have IQs that are about 15 points higher than the population average. So that's a lot, 15 points. It's about the average difference between the typical high school student and the typical state college student. It's a lot. And one of the things that means is, so imagine there's two distributions and that they
I'm just going to add here, it is a lot, but you might, when you're just meeting someone on the street and having a pleasant little conversation, you're likely not going to notice it. Or a lot of people wouldn't notice it, but it becomes noticeable the greater the selection criteria, right? Okay, so once you start having, let's say that you're in a team building activity or something, and you're about to apply yourself to a problem solving, some complex problem, that's when you are going to start to notice this
overlap, and that the Jewish one is the mean is 115, so the whole distribution is shifted to the right. What that means is that if you go up into the higher IQ strata, 130, 145, way the hell up there, that Jewish people are overwhelmingly overrepresented at the high end of the IQ distribution. Now, the price they pay for that is some increased propensity for neurological diseases that seems to be associated in some sense with that heightened IQ. Now, the science on this isn't settled, but it's reasonably solid, given the standards of such things. Okay, so Jews are going to be overrepresented at the high end of cognitively complex disciplines. So then I would say, and that's the case, like they're way overrepresented among like outstanding scientists and among Nobel Prize winners and so forth. And so, people look and they think, well, why are there a disproportionate number of Jewish people in positions of authority? And they say, well, it must be a conspiracy. It must be systemic in some sense. It's like, no, it can be simply accounted for by that relatively large IQ differential. Now, the next criticism would be, well, don't the Jews...
Okay, so I want to now play one more clip over here, which is Tom Sowell. And Tom Sowell again, but in this one, he's actually referring to, this is actually from the Rubin Report's YouTube channel. I couldn't find the original clip, but Tom Sowell commenting on where is the Jew hatred or the anti-Semitism coming from, or where could it potentially be stemming from. And this is something that I just haven't heard people talk about, and perhaps again, it's a in this book, right? Charles Murray, another very politically incorrect author. This book on IQ, and then also this book of his, Facing Reality, looks at IQ differences between racial groups. And again, do your own research, make up your own mind. It's like we're willing to acknowledge that there are differences between racial groups. Say, for example, when it comes to height or distribution of muscle twitch fibers, right? Fast twitch, slow twitch. You look at the 100-meter races and what kind of ethnicities we usually see dominating those races, or there are certain countries that will dominate certain athletic disciplines, and part of that it seems to be related to an underlying biology. But then I think the way that Murray puts it is we're willing to say that we're all different and we have differences between racial groups, but only below the head or below the neck, right? No one's willing to say there actually might be differences up here with respect to cognitive ability or average cognitive ability between the racial groups. But I mean, this is one of the instances, right? So that there does seem to be good evidence that Ashkenazi Jews and also Asians, as an example, have a higher average IQ compared to the general population. Now, you might then ask yourself, what about the rest of the racial groups? How do they all rank up? And what are the implications? What ought we expect in terms of outcomes so that we don't see disparities in outcomes between racial groups and misdiagnose as evidence of unfair discrimination? Okay? If, say, for example, Asians have a higher average IQ compared to the general population, maybe we ought to expect an overrepresentation or a disparity in representation, more Asians in roles that require high IQ or high degrees of cognitive ability. Now, another question for you, right? Goodness. We exist in an economy that is more and more valuing cognitive ability and devaluing labor. So in the past, there were certain, just take a particular individual. If you had, in the past, there were certain economies, right, where if you had a lot of extra muscle, you were good. You were very, very useful. You get paid better, yeah? And really having an exceptional IQ wasn't all that much of an asset if you're working in the field, yeah? But more and more, our economy is becoming more and more tech-based. And it's more and more valuing cognitive ability. And those with greater cognitive ability are being rewarded more and more. Those without cognitive ability are finding it harder and harder to be of significant value within the economy. And what's more, those with the cognitive ability are using that ability to essentially automate what used to be very valuable labor. So we have a problem here, right? Where those with greater cognitive ability, awesome, fantastic. We want them to flourish. We want them to manifest their potential because everyone benefits from it. But what are we going to do about these people who may not have the raw building blocks for high degrees of cognitive ability? So another way of saying that in a more direct manner is they're not as smart, fundamentally, right? Those who are smart are going to be served very well. Those who are not so smart, who may have in previous eras relied on contributing their physical labor, are now going to find it harder and harder to be of utility to bring a value to the economy or to the marketplace. What are we going to do about it? And here's where it gets tricky. What if there are differences between racial groups? Now that's some dynamite. Okay, so I'm going to leave you to think about that. What if we have differences in cognitive ability between different racial groups, and we also have an economy that is increasingly valuing cognitive ability? We're going to expect a growing inequality, say, for example, financially, a growing inequality between racial groups. And it may have nothing to do with unfair discrimination based solely on an arbitrary quality like one's skin color. It may actually be due to discrimination based on one's cognitive ability. But it does nonetheless mean that we have a problem. Like, what are we going to do about this? So I'm going to leave that as it is, leave that as an open question. Okay, so we just watched that JP clip. So if we have Jews having an average higher IQ, and we understand that differences in the mean can result in very significant disparities between groups at the extremes, right? All of our diagrams over here, yeah? If we understand this now, if we don't have our eyes wide open to this fact, can you see how it's very easy to see the disparity, right? See the disparity, or see the overrepresentation of Jewish people, say maybe in terms of wealth, the upper strata of wealth, and incorrectly diagnose as there has been some kind of unfair discrimination. Again, misdiagnose. And you can see how this could lead to an anti-Semitism or a Jewish hatred, or the spirit of Cain is what I would also... I wrote a track with one of the lyrics was, the spirit of Cain is here and back with a vengeance. The spirit of Cain being, it's a biblical reference. Instead of looking at those who perform better than you and asking, am I not making the appropriate sacrifices? Or maybe is this person simply more gifted or talented than I am? Instead of doing that, you look at the person succeeding, you look at the person doing well, and you say, they must have got there unfairly. I am the victim. Okay, now take a listen to Sol.
Because among the middleman minorities, of which the Jews are the most prominent, the hostility to these people in countries around the world is out of all proportion to that, to any other kind of group I can think of. In terms of violence, the number of Chinese killed, let's say, in 1 year, and by mob action, exceeds all the blacks lynched in the entire history of the United States. And the number of Armenians killed in Turkey, during the First World War, is greater than that. And of course, the number of Jews slaughtered on a number of occasions in history, even before the Holocaust, is greater than that. So that the question is, why this particular kind of people are the targets of so much venomous hatred? And I think the answer is that they not only succeed, they succeed in a way which is a threat to the egos of other people. But the guy who comes here, let's say from Vietnam or Korea, and arrives here with little more than the clothes on his back and a few words of broken English, and a decade later he has his own little business, and you see his son a few years after that getting ready to go off to Harvard or MIT, you got to ask yourself, you either got to, you've got to hate yourself for saying, my God, I've been stagnating, this guy was nothing and now he's risen up, or you're going to have to hate him. Years ago, one official of one of the...
Okay. Or you're going to have to hate him. The spirit of Cain is here and back with a vengeance. I want you to remember this. If there's one standard deviation difference between the means of two populations, which may not be that noticeable in everyday life, but then we have a selection criteria that is 4 standard deviations above the mean of the general population, or the population that had the lower mean between Group A and Group B, you're going to end up with a very, very significant and obvious disparity or difference in outcome between those two groups. And if you are not careful, if you are taking the blue pill, the convenient pill of ignorance, then you will misdiagnose that as you'll misdiagnose that disparity as evidence of unfair discrimination and use it as fuel to say, I am the victim, and maybe in this case, the Jews are the oppressors. When really, maybe they are just a little bit smarter. So, I think it's time to begin wrapping up this video. I alluded, before I come to equality above all, I want to finish what I'd written here. This is going to be a nice little summary, okay? Let's say we have two sample groups, A and B, of absolute equal numbers, both 1,000, derived from a wider population. And let's say group A is representative of that wider population, same mean and same variance or spread. Now let's say group B, in this case, let's say it's Ashkenazi Jews, I said it correctly, has the same variance or spread but a higher mean. Let's say 1 standard deviation above the mean of the wider population and thus above that of group A. This is roughly the difference in interest in things versus people between men and women. So you can think about the application of this thinking to the overrepresentation of men amongst engineers and women amongst nurses. If we then have a selection process that selects for individuals who have a value or score greater than 1 standard deviation above the mean, we will get 16% of group A and 50% of group B in our selected group. Okay, so just a quick diagram, right? Boom. Better over here. Yep. So we've got mean 1, mean 2. If we are choosing a selection criteria here, we're going to get 50% of population B passing the criteria, but we will have only this little portion of population A passing that criteria. Yeah. Which is why if we come back here, 16% of the general population or group A will make it past that selection criteria, whereas 50% of group B will. That's a ratio of approximately 1 to 3 group A to group B. Now let's make the selection or the selector more selective. Let's say it selects for only individuals who have a value or score greater than 2 standard deviations above the mean. Now we get only 2.5% of group A, but still 16% of group B, resulting in a ratio of roughly 1 to 6. And we can continue this process recursively. With a selection criteria of 3 standard deviations above the mean, the ratio becomes 1 to 17, and at 4 standard deviations above the mean, 1 to 42. So to summarize, with a difference in means between groups of only 1 standard deviations, we get the following ratios of group representation. 1 standard deviation above the mean, we should expect, assuming fair discrimination, a ratio of 1 to 3, 2 standard deviations, ratio of 1 to 6, 3 standard deviations, ratio of 1 to 17, and 4 standard deviations above the mean, a ratio of 1 to 42. And it not necessarily be evidence of unfair discrimination. This is why inequality is fair sometimes. So a small difference in means results in rather significant differences at the extremes. And if selection takes place at the extremes, then we ought to expect unequal representation of the two groups amongst those selected. In reality, you can combine this with an acknowledgement that the groups are rarely equally represented. And I just kind of pointed out here, you can take as an example Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, in my case, Australians. Now, let's now summarize. I want to tie this all together by finishing with an understanding of why. One, it can be ignorance, right? We can, by way of ignorance, assume, and this is certainly the position that I was in, I just thought that if there wasn't 50-50 distribution between like males and females, that there was evidence of unfair discrimination. And that was just ignorance. So, That could be why. But when someone is presented, say, with all of this information, with these facts, uncomfortable as they might be, the red pill, why do they choose, nonetheless, the blue pill? Why? Why do they choose the convenient blue pill of untruth? That's what I want to finish with here. It stems from this. It stems from this value of equality above all. And I've described it as the blue pill modern religion. Why are people prioritizing equality above all else? If we know everything that we've just covered, right? If we know that different people have different raw abilities, talents, and also different people have different values, right? Different raw abilities, different values, and we can apply this not only to individuals but also to groups. Why then do we expect equal outcomes? We can't expect equal outcomes. If given equal opportunity and we celebrate different ways of being, different people having different values, choosing to live their lives how they see fit, multiculturalism, and we're also willing to acknowledge the fact that different individuals and different groups have these raw abilities or differences in raw abilities, we cannot be pro equality of outcome. We cannot be pro equity. That is having your cake and eating it too, so to speak. They are mutually exclusive. You cannot be pro diversity and pro equality of opportunity and yet also be pro equality of outcome. That does not work. If you are for diversity, if you're for multiculturalism, if you're for individual autonomy, and you acknowledge the fact that different people have different values, you have to be okay with disparities. And then the question is, what degree of disparity should be a warning signal that unfair discrimination has occurred? And it's probably much more than you might realize. Yeah? And hopefully I've shown that to you by drawing out these normal distributions and showing you how fairly small differences at the means can result in enormous differences if selection takes place at the extremes. And it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with unfair discrimination. And all of this is to say, if there is disparity between two groups, you cannot assume that unfair discrimination has taken place. You are conveniently misdiagnosing. You're conveniently taking the blue pill and misdiagnosing as unfair discrimination has taken place because all things are not equal in outcomes between these different groups. But then in the same breath, you're saying, multiculturalism. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. There is a logical contradiction there. And so what I want to finish with is that people don't necessarily live out what they believe. Their beliefs aren't necessarily what is true when they're exposed to new information, to facts. They don't necessarily integrate those facts into their worldview. This was a major eye-opening moment for me. I thought, if you were exposed to new information, why would you not update your map of the world so as to be more accurate and then move with more purpose? When you it's like if there are problems, if there is limitation, if there is suffering, you want to be able to accurately identify where is that suffering coming from, what is the root cause, and then use that understanding as the basis from which to form a solution and do good in the world. If you want to do good in the world, then you want to align your map of reality with the underlying reality as accurately as possible, right? The problem is that people choose beliefs not based on necessarily what is true, but what meets their needs. And if people are desperate for a sense of meaning and purpose, and they don't have it, Man does not live on bread alone. They will look for what many have referred to as an ideology, an oversimplified worldview that clearly distinguishes the immoral from the moral, the bad guys and the good guys, and how convenient they're one of the good guys. A worldview, an ideology, an incomplete story or description of what is, a rejection of new information and facts, of truths, a rejection of, because they need a story that nourishes their spiritual needs or their egos, as Tom Sowell put it before. And I had this lyric in a track that I wrote not too long ago. Possessed by inclusion, I see delusion, you be afraid of the questions. Because when you ask someone these questions, could it be possible that maybe this disparity isn't born of unfair discrimination? When you test that assumption, coming right back to that person's mother that I was speaking with, who thought that it should be 50-50 distribution of male and female on boards, and if it wasn't, it's unfair discrimination. Me asking questions, probing questions to test assumptions, to say, could it maybe be because men and women choose different things, and maybe that's why it might be 70-30? Could it possibly be? The reason why that was met with such hostility, the reason why that was treated like it was the wrong question, even though I was pursuing truth so as to hopefully, if we can identify unfair discrimination, hey, let's go fight it together. But no, the reason why it was treated with the hostility it was because I was threatening taking away the convenient blue pill belief that was meeting this person's needs. She needed to feel like she was the savior. She'd spent the last 10 years of her life, roughly, fighting the evil patriarchy. And here I was, very inconveniently pointing out that maybe you're playing out Don Quixote. Maybe you're fighting phantoms. Maybe you're fighting the evil patriarchy that actually doesn't exist. Maybe men and women are making different choices. And maybe that's okay. Maybe. And so in asking these questions, I was threatening her sense of purpose, her sense of meaning. And not just now, but I was undermining perhaps the utility of her work over the past decade. And I was altogether threatening the victim-savior dynamic. There is this trauma bond, it's almost like a trauma bond going on in our modern era, wherein those who want to abdicate responsibility for making something of themselves, those who would like more power, more entitlement, would like to get rid of the burden of performance. Every gift is also a curse. Every privilege comes with a responsibility. And so maybe you want to abdicate all of that responsibility by self-identifying as the victim. And then this is convenient for those who are bereft of meaning, who are desperate for a victim, so much so that they will affirm any and all victimhood claims so as to be the savior. Which is why you might be wondering, why are people so conveniently, quickly assuming that any disparity is evidence of discrimination? And it's because that is their primary source of meaning and purpose. They need a victim in order for themselves to be saviors. Whereas maybe there are some uncomfortable and inconvenient truths with respect to the differences between groups and the implications that this might have for the results that those different groups produce. All in all, sometimes inequality is fair, and disparity does not necessarily equal unfair discrimination. If you found this video helpful, I think that's a good place to wrap up. You can check out some of these books. This is kind of like an integration of a lot of these ideas. So first and foremost, let me jump back over here. I'll pop a link to all of these in the description. First and foremost, Discrimination and Disparities by the gentleman Tom Sowell that you've seen here. Warren Farrell's Why Men Earn More kind of applies that same principle or theory to the disparities between men and women's earnings. The Bell Curve, I think it's chapter 8, something like this. This really looks at IQ. And then there's, I think chapter 8 is the one that looks at the differences in IQ between racial groups. That's then applied more specifically, I suppose, in Charles Murray's book, Facing Reality, which again, that entire book is more so looking at the disparity between racial groups with respect to IQ, and exploring some of the implications of that in the same way that I did it with the Jews. Exploring some of the implications. You might also, if you want to understand the victim-savior dynamic or the trauma bonding that is going on there, then it might be worth reading Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks to understand where this notion of any and all interpretations of how to be in the world are equal, and then how that has been adapted to essentially take the Communist Manifesto and Marxism, and instead of it being the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, seeing anything and everything, all disparities, as evidence of there is an oppressor and the oppressed. And that's only possible or made possible by those desperate for meaning saviors who are willing to affirm victims, self-identifying victims, and the oppressed wherever they can find them. You might also like to read Cynical Theories. That also helps tie it all together, or kind of apply those two last books to the modern era. And then another useful one, Are Cops Racist? Again, applying the same lens of maybe disparity between racial groups with respect to their interactions with police isn't necessarily evidence of cops being racist, but it might actually have something to do with the behavior of the two racial groups. So all of that said, I hope that you found this video helpful, and have a great day.